Hello, everyone. Welcome to another AMA episode for Coinchange. Today, we have guests from Securrency, and it's a tokenization platform, so digital tokenization. They offer institutional grade compliance. They have a patented system for that, which we'll get into in a few minutes. And they have capital markets as well as part of their offering. So they are playing in the space of close to, you guys are estimating $16 trillion of market size by 2030, which is huge, and specifically catering to institutional DeFi. So this is in line with the research that we are working on. So the research team at Coinchange is currently writing a research report on the institutional DeFi, and we came across you guys through the research efforts. And so we would like to learn more about your offerings and how you guys are navigating through this. So my understanding is you guys started in 2015. So I'm curious if you could lay out how your journey was so far and give us a brief about your offerings.
Yeah, thanks, Pratik. Good to be here with you and Jerome, and also with my colleagues, Tyler Carter, who heads up our DeFi team, and Jackson Mueller, who heads up our policy and government relations team. So yeah, I will make one slight correction. Tokenization is something that we do, and certainly compliant tokenization, but it's a small part of the overall technology stack that we built, which is really sort of an end-to-end infrastructure to support digital assets in regulated contexts. So yeah, as you said, we began in 2015, and like a lot of startups, a few folks, a few developers, building out technology on the back of an idea, and that idea was not just the tokenization of assets, but the ability to build in both business logic, which we know as smart contracts, but also compliance logic to be able to automate compliance and business functions and streamline the movement of value. And so for that, really the objective was to build out a comprehensive infrastructure built around, as you indicated, a universal compliance framework. And the principles on which we base that were, number one, compliance is the key to liquidity, the ability to move assets between different institutional environments, but in accordance with the rules that are applicable in those in those different jurisdictions and across those different environments. So, for example, payments are treated differently than securities are treated. But in our world, the same asset can be a security at one moment and a payment in a different context. So it needs to be able to comply with all of those regulations in those different contexts and do that in real time without having to stop at every border. Now, certainly from the crypto world, everyone knows that things are liquid, when the boundaries are taken down. But when regulators are looking in and those boundaries are up, we still need that same velocity of movement. And so we began with that compliance, that recognition that compliance would be a critical component. The second thing was that we really focus on being ledger agnostic. In our world, the way that we look at it, there are different reasons why you might use different blockchains, horses for courses, as it were. And so we really needed to be interoperable, and that led to the build out of what we would think of as kind of a layer 3 infrastructure solution. And then the third thing was really that we needed to be able to white label this, the implementation of this infrastructure for both institutional purposes, and then also at maybe smaller brokerage levels, to create what we refer to as a global liquidity network. So the ability for all these different platforms to interoperate with each other, to be able to expose that value across that broader ecosystem and transact in it. So that was the idea from 2015. And it was ahead of its time, as we grew in 16 and 17, out of the garage into more of a traditional startup. That moment in time was dominated by ICOs, and we were the we were the nerds in the corner with the bow ties, working on institutional grade compliance solutions. But we really foresaw this intersection where the institutional world and the DeFi world would, begin to converge. And so we set up shop at that intersection, and we believe that we're in the right place at the right time.
Very impressive, gotta say. That leads to my question, which is pertaining to actually the users. So you're referring to TradFi and institutionals. Could you provide some examples and perhaps use cases of your major clients that you are focusing on?
Yeah, certainly. So I'll answer that in two ways. So the infrastructure is intended to be universal. So when I refer to the infrastructure, it's not just, we have a saying, it's Securrency, tokenization is not enough. But I go even further. KYC AML is not enough either, right? If you're developing tokenized securities, they need to comply with sophisticated and sometimes policies that need to be interpreted around securities regulations. And then if that asset is going to move between jurisdictions, it needs to comply with the securities regulations of both jurisdictions. And so that framework for building out those policy sets needs to be robust. But then you got to go even further. You need to build in robust identity services. You need to build in account management or wallet management services, and you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And when Tyler talks a little bit about our DeFi initiatives, you'll see there are other tools that go along with it. So this is really deep institutional grade infrastructure. And what that means is that we can deploy it for a large bank, a large custodial bank, for example. We could deploy it for a transfer agent or a CSD. We could deploy it for a large asset manager who wants to perform their own issuance. We could deploy it for a government who wants to issue, say, tokenized bonds, fixed income assets, or other, government issued securities. So it's designed to be, white labeled and implemented in all of those different contexts. But as implemented in those different environments, it's then interoperable. So that's if I take that and now if I'm a little bit more specific around who are our clients right now, they fall into different categories. So you've probably heard a lot about WisdomTree, who's one of our main investors and a leading asset manager. WisdomTree is deploying our technology. They've now launched 17 SEC approved 1940 Act funds. So these are public funds. And their thesis is they're using this tokenization vehicle to go direct to retail. So they've launched an app called WisdomTree Prime, where they can go direct to retail and create their own sort of ecosystem of value around these tokenized assets, which live side by side with regulated digital dollars and maybe other crypto assets in that environment. We also do a lot of work with large institutions like US Bank and State Street. Both of those are custodial institutions, but beyond that large custodial role, they also have different, focal areas. So within a bank, you might be doing a bunch of different projects. So you might, on the one hand, be working with them on transfer agency, on the other hand, working with them on a private assets issuance platform, or a fixed income platform, or something like that. It's all built off the same infrastructure, just different front end workflows. We also will work with large exchanges. We're doing work with L1s, giving them the tokenization and our compliant wallet solutions as well, the large digital custodians as well. So you can see it's a wide range of participants, but the commonality is that they fit into one of those three main segments. You're either creating assets, servicing assets, or distributing assets, and our infrastructure and that compliance aware token framework supports all of those roles.
Fantastic. This could be a question for any of you, maybe Tyler on the institutional side. So yeah. I'm curious, what is it, in your opinion, that is missing in the traditional finance institutions that tokenization can help them overcome? and you guys are helping them overcome?
Yeah, definitely. I think largely the answer to that going forward is going to be DeFi, right? So I think it's all sort of based around this singular question of why would you tokenize when there's already these fund markets that are pretty large, pretty efficient, and pretty cheap. So the answer for me is in addition to the bevy of sort of differentiators that tokenization provides, including 24/7 trading and fractional trading of shares, things like that, it's still sort of failed to deliver on that promise to date. So what Patrick described to you is really what enables these assets to take this next step in terms of liquidity, and that's transportability. So securities tokens that can move across ecosystem, whether they're peer-to-peer, centralized exchange to DEX, DEX back to centralized exchange. That's what our compliance framework enables. So what we have with DeFi is really the solution to, why would people want to tokenize? And that's additional products and services that aren't available in traditional markets. A lot of that is based around new types of yield, but it's also based around things that have been largely institutional to date that we can open up and bring to retail parties. So if you think about like securities lending, that's very similar to what MakerDAO is talking about when they're onboarding RWA collateral now. So essentially what we have is, this security lending product that's been reserved for either high net worth individuals or largely institutions. And it's, a bread and butter product and service for those institutions. And now we're able to bring that to the hands of retail investors. And I think that's going to be, just one example of what drives people to tokenized assets.
Just to add on real quick, from a policy, government relations perspective, we're starting to see a lot more conversations turning towards this direction of kind of how do you kind of bridge both these worlds of TradFi, DeFi in a compliance in a responsible manner, right? And so I think if you look at the Bank for International Settlements working with the Monetary Authority of Singapore on Project Guardian, and then you also see the recent release of Project Mariana. Several of those projects really dovetail into a lot of what we are focused on here and have been focused on for the last, oh my gosh, eight years now. And we're just starting to see those conversations really starting to percolate among a number of jurisdictions, not just within Europe and in particular some of the member states, but also looking at some of the countries in Asia in particular that are also focused on this. So it's certainly, as Patrick said, the right time. And being in the middle of both TradFi and DeFi makes us pretty well positioned here, not only from an industry but also from a policy perspective as well.
Yeah, the inclusion of Curve V2 in that Mariana report was, I think, huge for the industry. If anyone hasn't checked that out, I'd encourage them to go look at that paper.
Right. That's a good segment, I think, to my question related to permission and permissionless. So in our report, we are basically making the case that there's high chances that institution will enter DeFi, but via the permission route. I'm interested in understanding if your framework and what you guys are doing is allowing for deploying on permission blockchain and also permissionless blockchain, and is this in a way just the interface that the institution need to go through, and then whatever they do, if it's on a permission blockchain or permissionless, it's their case, not yours.
Yeah, so this is a question for all three of us. So I'll lead in. I think Tyler will have some really interesting points to add here, and certainly some of what I say will lead directly into Jackson's take on this as well from the policy perspective. So the short answer is we support both intentionally. We support both, and we do work with both. So WisdomTree has deployed on two public ledgers. One of the key features of our framework is, again, you can, because it's a hybrid on-chain off-chain, we're able to maintain a good control location via an off-chain mirror. And so WisdomTree, for example, has launched funds that are issued on both the Ethereum and the Stellar ledger simultaneously, for example, right? And those are both public ledgers, both approved by the SEC. And so we've done that. And then in other instances, when we're working with large institutions, they have permission ledgers. So sometimes it's their, internal version of Hyperledger Besu or something like that. And so we can do both. Philosophically, we believe very strongly in public ledgers, and permissionless. But one of the things that, and this is a more recent development that is giving the institutions pause, is that the questions are coming up not about the security of the ledger, and it's not even about KYC AML, because those things can be maintained and managed. And again, with the automation in our system, you can control the distribution of these assets in any case. It's really around the network token, the provenance of the minting or the mining of that token. It's all of these sorts of things that actually relate not so much to the ledger, but to the crypto asset associated with the ledger, that are really slowing, or I'm going to say chilling, the banks. And so the banks will say something like, ultimately, we want to be on permissionless, but we're afraid to start there because of the regulatory uncertainty. So let's start on a permissioned version and then see where that goes. And that's sort of the attitude that we've seen over the last 9-12 months. Tyler, I'll bring it over to you here.
Yeah, I think, certainly that's become like a super hot topic, right? Permission ledgers. I guess I'll view it in two stages. I certainly don't think public ledgers are going to go away. What I think you'll see is institutions sort of using private permissioned blockchains or subnets as a sandbox where they can, test these concepts in private, which makes sense for an institution, but also there's some products and services and just, generic tasks that they're going to want to keep private in perpetuity. So really, I see them operating those probably going forward and then connecting to public ledgers for some activities and keeping some private. And, I think in that way, we'll, have a hybrid system that benefits everyone. I don't think it has to be either or, but I, certainly understand sort of, I don't want to call it a pivot, but let's say the interest in private permission at the moment. To double back to what Patrick said, we're pretty agnostic and we're, advocates for public ledgers, but we can also spin up subnets for folks. And again, I think that sort of dovetails with the fact that the compliance lives within our asset. So, the overlying idea is, a person can, buy this security token that uses our compliance framework, but they can still take it off into a, permissionless DeFi ecosystem, because we can control, in that manner who they're interacting with, and they can still come back to a compliance or a permission network after that, because we've traced that chain of custody through the whole life cycle of the asset. I think at some point too, maybe it's worth a little bit of a discussion. I think you're going to end up seeing like a merger of these two things, right? Like permissioned and permissionless. I think there's a lot of advantages for running, traditional processes on the institutional side through DeFi-like mechanisms. Patrick, you can attest to this. We've done a lot of work with institutions on mapping out decentralized securities lending frameworks, and the cost savings there are so massive, for the institutions that they're not going to walk away from this stuff. I'm not going to say we have the answer yet, but certainly there's a lot of potential value on the table, enough that I think it gets worked out in a positive way, even though it's not quite there yet.
I agree.
Just to add on top of that, and sorry for going in and out, but I'd say that the what gets raised at the policy and regulatory levels is how do we provide, how does this interoperability work between the more decentralized networks and the traditional side of things, right? And I certainly think that's something that Securrency has been able to cater towards in addressing that challenge that is frequently raised. The other thing that I hear a lot in various reports, and certainly industry reports, is that everything should just exist on chain. And I'm not sure that really, based on our conversations with a variety of regulators, they have a number of concerns with everything being listed, on chain, and certainly, ledger being compromised, and what happens in that sort of stance, and how do you get back up and do operational, how do you get your operations back up to speed? So that we're certainly seeing that message being displayed more and more. But again, one of the interesting things that we're seeing is, BIS and several other multilaterals in particular, and some of the work that's being done by several central banks around Bridge, for instance, the multi CBDC ledger, looking for these network. How do we establish a network of networks in catering to all of this? And that is something that's currently underway across several jurisdictions right now in various pilots. It's certainly something that keeps me employed because they keep producing reports every 3 days. So it's been a lot of activity around this space, and something that frankly we've been focused on and realizing we're heading towards since we began operations in 2015. So when we ingest those reports, when we bring them in, we figure out the challenges that they cite, also the potential that they cite from these various reports. That's when I get Tyler, that's when I get Patrick and several others on our team. We hit the beach and we storm the beaches essentially. And it's not necessarily going on Twitter and ripping regulatory authorities and saying you should have done this, or you can't do this, and how dare you. Frankly, we have simply extended a hand and said, use this as a resource. We've been focused on some of the underlying challenges and issues that you talk about and have increasingly talked about for the last 12 months. And so that's usually our pitch going into these meetings is tell us about what you're doing, but then from there we can explain a little bit more about Securrency services, how they apply to some of the challenges that have been raised, and seeking to kind of breach these walls that some of the regulators in industry seemingly face as they move forward on this.
Yeah, but Jackson, that's such a good point. I'll point out like a dichotomy that's in this. Protect you started with this $16 trillion opportunity, right? I think what everyone fails to miss in sort of those like Twitter tirades is the only way we get to 16 trillion is through figuring this out in a regulatory manner. So to get there and realize the full potential, I think we need to start having more positive conversations. And it's a give and a take from both sides. But I think we're just getting there, right? Just getting to the beginning of that. So I have high hopes.
And to jump on top of that, it's not we're not saying everything needs to be ripped out and replaced, right? That there are current regulatory frameworks behind a lot of the traditional assets that we see, or most of the assets that we see out there in the traditional sense, that can be tokenized and distributed across these various distributed networks that have the regulatory constructs that have been with them from the traditional sense for the past several years, if not several decades. So the regulation and compliance is there. Obviously, there's a number of things that, yes, may need to be amended, may need to be rethought, but it's not a wholesale restructuring of the regulatory frameworks that have been in place for decades.
That's such a good example, and we're not even the first industry to go through this. And I'll give a specific example, pertaining to these first SEC registered funds. So I come from the ETF industry, even though I was in crypto that whole time before I pivoted full-time crypto. But what happened with the ETF industry, right? We're building on top of mutual fund registrations. So those were decades old laws that ETFs were shoehorned into. And at the beginning, when they launched ETFs, off those existing registrations, some of those features that have made their way into ETFs now were limited, right? So ETFs essentially had to apply for exemptive relief, which granted them, new powers and capabilities to realize the full potential of that wrapper. Tokenization is no different, right? The first SEC registered tokens went through a mutual fund registration act from 1940, and we're going to need to go through the same exemptive relief process to realize 24/7 trading. We can definitely sort of shoehorn it in a manufactured way already, but it's a process is my overall point, right? So we start with the existing regulatory frameworks, we prove it's working, and then we can add additional features and services once we've proved that.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. I know we've been on this topic for a bit, but I'll just conclude because on with this one here, that and I do want to spend a little bit of time in our conversation here talking a bit about our Composer product and our which is really the heart of the DeFi capabilities that we bring to the table. Although I was on with a very large institutional client yesterday, and they said, could you please stop saying DeFi and use the term smart contracts, because it doesn't scare our people as much. I said, okay, that's fine. But in that, that 24/7 is a function of real-time pricing, which is another automation component, right? That needs to be brought in along with the real-time compliance, and that's the powerful combination there. When you get away from sort of this, you have a digital wrapper, but then you have this manual process of sort of striking the nav. When we can get out of that, and there's a lot of conversation about, well, will these things trade away from nav? And I think that that's kind of missing the point. The real point is, will these things have a real-time live value that's automated and built in and move, in accordance with that? And can it be reconciled across all those layers? One of the problems that these institutions try to solve here is, for example, in managing collateral. You can automate that functionality within the institution, say in a securities lending framework or repos or whatever the case may be. But then you need to actually have that real-time data that goes all the way back to the ultimate beneficial owner for tax purposes, for example, right? And that should just be one. That should be one, single data source, drilling all the way through all that functionality. That's the real promise of DeFi, and that's the real promise of blockchain, really.
This is a great conversation because we had another guest a few AMAs ago, and it was a similar discussion where a lot of the people have the tendency to go on Twitter and bash the SEC regulations, and it's not productive. The better use of our time is to see how we can work with them and how we can work together to progress, because we won't be able to get to those goals unless we work with them, and the institutions won't come in if we are just all the time bashing the regulators. So refreshing to hear this, for sure.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, and look, acknowledging that doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that they do either, right? But
exactly.
But you can't actually have a conversation with them if you're just shouting in their face, right? So they're more apt to listen to where they're making mistakes when you're actually engaged in a conversation with them.
Right. And the example that you're providing, Tyler, with the ETFs and the mutual funds is in my opinion, very telling of perhaps what needs to happen for us and what eventually will happen, right? Otherwise, institutional adoption can't happen if there is no transfer from legacy law, legacy regulation, and then just slowly being changed in order to fit, innovation and so on.
It'll go back. This is very similar to the SEC lending example I gave in terms of the value proposition, but you've seen BlackRock step into the space filing a Bitcoin ETF. But we talked to all those major ETF providers about tokens, as the next wrapper after ETFs. And when you look at how that entire life cycle of management for the product can be automated via smart contracts, whether it's the ETF sponsor ingesting data that's been put on blockchain from the index provider or the data provider to automating back and middle office functions. There's a world of savings that tokenized vehicles can provide over ETFs, which are the gold standard at the moment. So institutions are just catching on to this. We work with a lot of the first movers in that space. But once they start to come in and you're, sort of seeing this wave start to form, that's what'll push regulations, right? There's just simply too much on the table to, I think, ignore it.
Right. I would have a question in regards to tokenization and what will essentially push forward this sector for DeFi and adoption by institution. I would like to have your opinion into what is the major asset that needs to be tokenized or that is currently being tokenized, that is the one that will basically propel everyone inside. Is it like CBDCs? Is it securities? Is it bond? So we have examples of tokenization of each of those. But in your opinion, what's the one that will actually have institution really start to come in?
So this is an excellent question. And I think a big part of the problem within the industry is there's not enough of a recognition of the distinction between the asset class that shows the most promise for so you can think about it, say, well, where do we have the most difficulty, which gives us the greatest possible solution, right? So and immediately people think about private assets and they say, hey, listen, the private markets are illiquid, and if we tokenize, we have the promise of liquidity. And I think that that's generally true, but that's not the same as saying that that's the asset class that will spur adoption the fastest. It holds the most promise and it intrigues people, but people are still trying to figure out, well, how do we get there? And a big fundamental problem that you have is you have this chicken egg problem, where investment into infrastructure is held back because people are like, well, I'm waiting for adoption. But then the asset creators say, well, I'm waiting for the infrastructure, right? And so this is the this dilemma, and of course the answer has to be that the infrastructure has to go into place, because where people have, and this is why I push back on tokenization platform a little bit, where people have said, hey, I've got a tokenization platform, look, I tokenize your asset, and it just went there. And then what? Well, no, that's it. That's the whole story. It just went there, right? So what, right? So really, if you do that once, you're not going to do it again, right? That's why you need the whole infrastructure. It's like a roller coaster that's only like 100 feet long. Well, who cares? That's not a fun ride. You got to do more. So in that, I think that if we're going to look at an asset class that spurs adoption, we have to look at an asset class that is actually already liquid, where people are getting used to doing new things with this asset class, but also liquid enough that you can do really cool, what I call sort of, okay, let's call DeFi things with them, right? Where, for example, they can actually perform multiple roles. So tokenizing a money market fund, for example, is not just tokenizing a fund, but it's also creating a stable instrument, right? Something that can act as collateral in other transactions. And so even though it's not sexy from a yield perspective, it's sexy from a utility perspective, and then you can build from there. And so that's why I think you'll see that the asset class that will and is really being pushed forward faster than any other are public funds. They are these and because there are no retail exchanges, they're really, you can think of them as mutual funds in a tokenized wrapper. But that's where I see the beginning point. A lot of work has been done on the real estate side, and there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these real estate tokenization projects, but those also seem to be kind of roads and because they're missing that core infrastructure that allows for pricing at a global scale, which will then and the compliance at a global scale, which will then allow all those assets to move more freely. Plus, I think that there's a curation element. I think that model actually devolves into more of a fund or a REIT type model, but that's a whole different story. I think public funds will be the first and the fastest, at least as far as when we talk about sort of real world assets, but soon to be followed by other things. Again, as I said, private assets hold the most promise, for being truly transformational, but much more infrastructure needs to be built to really unlock all of that value. I'm sure Tyler and Jackson may have some slightly different views. That is my own personal editorial view.
No, I mean, I see public funds certainly driving that. I mean, those are the biggest components of the market, overall in terms of AUM. So I think it's a natural fit. The only thing I was going to add is, when you think about like developing markets, and this is sort of our unique value proposition, is those public funds being able to interact in DeFi. DeFi is really the only mature market, or let's say market that's mature enough to support, businesses at this point. So I think unlocking those or those economies as sort of consumers of these securitized or compliant products, whatever you want to call it, is going to be a big piece of what Patrick said. I'd add trade finance into one of those killer use cases. Having a lot of conversations with various banks, and trade finance is ripe for automation. It's super fragmented, super manual. So whenever you hear those words, you have a basis for something that could be impacted in a positive way through smart contracts. I think they have something like a few $100 billion gap, meaning that they can't finance up to a few $100 billion in trade deals, which is utterly massive when you think about the global economy and how much it depends on trade. So if you can envision even like you can use a CDP, like a different version of MakerDAO, to close that gap. And then even if DeFi yields aren't enough to draw people in, you can even use like the underlying trade receivables to form the basis of that yield. So you'd have like trade finance companies operating their own pools, using that pooled capital to finance trade deals and close those gaps. Like, these are very real, use cases that people are just beginning to work on. But the infrastructure is there already. It's waiting on participants, and we're seeing the first movers come in now. But
that's a super point, Tyler. That's a super point. I mean, and again, I think the question is framed was, sort of what will materialize first. But I completely agree with you. Trade finance and frankly debt is just an asset class that is perfect for smart contracts and blockchain. And back to what you were saying, Tyler, in terms of trade finance, 100%. I mean, the LOI or the LOC, the letter of credit is, I mean, it's streamlined as it can get in the manual world, but it's still so cumbersome and still so inefficient and still so unnecessary. When you can automate this and eliminate the counterparty risk and automate the release triggers and all of that stuff, I think that you're 100% correct in terms of where you unlock the most value. There is a lot of work being done there. But again, debt is another place, just debt instruments generally, just right for, and then when you bring it together, this is some of the work that, our founder, Dan Doney, is working on, is bringing that together, the automation down at the, let's call it the underlying level, where you have a fund that owns these debt instruments and it's straight line automated all the way through. That becomes super powerful when you have a self-processing fund. And all of the implications for that. So those are really, really ripe use cases for sure.
I'll just add on top of that, because I know we've got about a couple minutes left here, but just to give you guys some numbers on top of that. So if you had access to the Bernstein report that recently came out, they forecast a $5 trillion tokenization opportunity within the next 5 years, and then they break that out by various asset classes, right? So they're looking at private market funds, for instance, 5% of a $13 trillion market right now, that gets you to 650 billion. Securities, they're looking at 90 billion opportunity right now within the next 5 years. Corporate bonds, 400 billion. Equities, around 400 billion. Real estate, they split it up by residential and commercial. Residential, they're looking at a $260 billion opportunity. Commercial, 300 billion. And then you look at currency, right? And they look at the stable coins, CBDCs, et cetera. And they have it as 0.5% of a $140 trillion market, and that gets you to 2.8 trillion right there. So that all of that makes up roughly a $5 trillion opportunity just within the next 5 years.
Yeah, and if you buy the message, right, that like blockchain is moves value the way the internet moves information, right? I think that total opportunity is like 100 trillion, something in that neighborhood, right? All assets, so a lot on the table.
Yep.
I think
we've kind of answered our question about the TAM. We were wondering what would be the total addressable market in this section. Speaking of infrastructure that's compliant, maybe Jackson, you can help us understand what is the compliance-aware token framework that you guys are put together. What exactly is it?
Patrick, do you want to start, and I can kind of follow on top?
I'm happy to. Well, this is our crown jewel, so this is a centerpiece of everything we do. So the compliance aware token framework is, as I indicated before, kind of a hybrid on-chain, off-chain, both record keeping, record correction, and pre-trade compliance automation framework. So effectively, just to really simplify things, when we think about when tokenization platforms talk about compliance, they're typically talking about two very straightforward things. One is kind of the onboarding compliance, AML, KYC, and two is the corresponding whitelisting, right? Where they say, okay, well, this wallet has been cleared to interact with that asset. That's a useful starting point, but it really is only a starting point. A better model is one in which you as an individual participant have a set of credentials, and the asset has a policy, and the asset simply looks at your credentials and determines whether or not you can participate, you can transact in that asset, whether you have the appropriate credentials. So the example, it's a silly example. I use two very silly analogies, but I think they help to illustrate. One is the difference between a party where you have to be on the guest list and a party where you have to have, say, the right shoes. The first one, if you're not on the guest list, you just simply can't get in. The second one, if you show up with the right shoes, you can get in, right? So your credentials match the criteria. In the second analogy is, and I think this is where it becomes really, really important, is because we tend to create these venues that are limited by the credentials. So we say, hey, this is a private marketplace and this is a public marketplace. And why? Well, because we have to screen everyone at the door to make sure that they can participate. But really what we're thinking about is credentials. A supermarket doesn't work that way. So if I walk into a supermarket with my daughter who just turned 17, and we both grab a 6-pack of beer, she's going to get stopped at the cash register and told, no, you can't buy that because you don't have the right credentials. But it doesn't mean that we have to go shop in separate stores, right? Our ability to go interact with the inventory is based on our credentials. That's how the market should work. And so if you think about, for example, securities regulations, the way they exist right now, there's so much around marketing rules. I want to make sure that you're not showing this thing to the wrong person. Well, that's kind of irrelevant. You can show it to whoever you want, but their credentials determine whether or not they can interact with it. So those rules are the kinds of rules that, regulators can quickly, when they get comfortable with this framework, can quickly look at it and say, hey, we can change the way that we think about that. That leads to all sorts of other funny business, right? Why is it that if you're a fintech and you charge a fee based on the transaction value, you're suddenly deemed to be a broker dealer in the US? Well, because they think that you're involved with marketing, right? And that's the no-no, right? So these rules are built around that check them at the door kind of concept, and we're breaking away from that. So CADF is a dynamic framework. What we're doing is we're extracting attributes, so not your PII. When you go through your onboarding process, we are, you are essentially exposing certain attributes about you as an individual participant. One of those attributes may be your nationality. One of those attributes may be where you actually reside, which may be different than your nationality. One may be your accreditation status. One is certainly whether a verification agent has cleared you for KYC. One is whether your funds are clean. Those are all attributes. And so what we do is we map those attributes to a wallet. And then we also have a tool called the Rules Engine that allows you to create, in plain language, create a policy set, a complex policy set for the asset. These are the rules, and they can be regulatory rules or they can be transactional rules. I could say, I only want my asset to be ever held by people whose first name begin with T. And so, Tyler can't send it to Jackson, right? That can be enforced in this same framework, right? And so all that happens is, just as I said, when a transaction is proposed, the asset declares its policy to the compliance oracle. The compliance oracle checks the credentials of the participants and says go or no go. That's the basic CADF framework, and it's interoperable again across multiple ledgers, legacy systems. And that, like I said, that's the crown jewel. So hopefully I didn't steal too much of your thunder there, Jackson, if you want to layer on sort of the regulatory components there.
No, I mean, again, this is just what we've been hearing over the last year or two, right? And it's something that reflects the CATF framework in particular, and how CATF can help address this. But we've heard from multiple regulatory jurisdictions and regulatory authorities of this growing, not necessarily concern, but recognition that convergence is happening and it's going to continue to happen, right? And whether it be between various markets or products and services, there's a lot of folks that are foreseeing this right now, especially in the
We lost your audio, Jackson.
Yeah, we lost Jackson's audio. He doesn't know. He's
I think
happy.
he's lost ours.
He's happy.
Jackson, we can hear you.
Oh, we're losing so much vital insight into the regulatory landscape.
No, okay. While we figure this out, Patrick, I loved your examples. Your analogies are fantastic. It's so much clearer now. I read about this framework, a similar framework or proposal in one of the institutional reports by, I think it was Oliver Wynn something.
Oliver Wyman, yeah.
Yeah, Oliver Wyman, yeah. So they had this concept of having VCs, which is verified credentials, and there'll be authorities that would act as the verifiers for the credentials, and those are the participants that will be allowed to execute or interact with a particular transaction. Even though the pool might be on a decentralized and permissionless blockchain, your credentials will decide whether you can participate in those pools or protocols or not. So
yeah, that's right. I mean, JP Morgan and Jackson referenced Project Guardian earlier, and JP Morgan is working with the verified credentials concept. Slightly different. We think it's first of all, that's a start. That's again a very important starting point. That verification of the credentials. We've got to go one layer past that to get to where we are with CATF, which is then you take those verified credentials and you match them with the policy set. And one more really important component, you can create a policy on any chain just in the form of a smart contract and drop it onto that chain and say, okay, well, I can now, create this sort of regulatory perimeter around my asset on this chain. But you can't do it without our framework, is you can't actually take that policy and have it move from that chain to another chain. The best that people will do right now is they'll say, well, I'll replicate the policy on both chains, but that actually creates a reconciliation risk if the policy changes or, if there's any discrepancy between the policies, right? And that also makes it more difficult for a regulator, for example, to audit, or even your own compliance officer to audit it. We maintain one instance of the policy that gets replicated on. So the core instance is in this off chain that gets replicated in whatever different environments there are. So there's one master of that, and so we can take those verification, those credentials that you were referencing, Pratik, and say, okay, we can use those as the credentials for the wallet, and then match those against that central policy for the for the asset. And so that means that, you can do things as an asset manager that you couldn't do before. You can say, I can distribute this asset, in Japan and Brazil and in United States simultaneously, all in compliance and from one single record where I don't have to, reconcile with a broker in Japan. I can drill down all the way. I can see in real time all the way down at the wallet level and ensure that the compliance, is consistent throughout. So it's really powerful, and obviously we're very proud of CATF. That is our centerpiece.
We just to add on to that, we've had pretty in-depth discussions with a number of regulators around the world, reflecting on CATF and in particular, showing various regulators in different jurisdictions of the world. Cross-border transaction policy and enforcement and distribution control of the various tokenized assets. And in addition to that, custody, control locations, transaction reversibility, all these issues that are seen somewhat as as challenges, and we see it pop up in various reports and media, are something that we've, through CADF have been able to show and demonstrate to a number of regulators around the world that this is actually possible, and that this is not a pipe dream or something that will emerge 10 to 15 years from now.
I mean, that's really fascinating. It's really flipping the issue on its head, and I believe is kind of the solution that that we're just waiting for as infrastructure to enable like massive adoption. Just, it's removing a lot of the barriers that exist as of today for adoption. That's awesome.
Absolutely. And one thing, just as you guys, wrap your head around the whole thing, a lot of times we're asked, oh, does that mean that, Securrency has to maintain that? No, we actually, this is deployed, again, in a white label format. And so an issuer can be their own, can manage their own control location for the asset, or they can delegate that control to a transfer agent if that's, required, or CSD for that matter. So it's designed to, be completely flexible, used at the, at the institutional level, at the individual broker level, at the individual issuer level, but all interoperable across a broader ecosystem.
Very insightful. I guess that's all the question. Very insightful, like I said, discussion. And I think we learned a lot of things today, and hopefully a lot of people will get to see this video so that they understand that infrastructure is like the solution to the chicken and egg problem. And yeah, anything to add, Pratik?
No, I mean, the conversation can keep on going on. There's so many topics to touch on, but learned quite a lot today. And I love the analogies and examples that you have to make this topic easier to understand. Yeah, I guess that was quite insightful for us. Very insightful.
Well, thanks, Pratik. Thanks, Jerome. We appreciated the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.